Hi, my name's Andy Sykes. I'm an illustrator and animator, and I teach animation at universities here in the UK. Why not check out my website, hexjibber.com, where you can find animation and illustration by me, as well as more lessons in Flash and After Effects. Cheers! Hi, I thought I'd do a tutorial on how to create what we call elemental animation. So that's things like fire and smoke and water. They're quite difficult to do, but I've found a technique that lets you do them in a more simple way. So this tutorial I'm going to do now is just to show the basics of how to use what's called the wave warp effect in After Effects, and then combine that with some drawn animation in Flash. So let's take a look at the kind of thing I'm talking about. Here are some examples of some animation that I've done. This is a wave that's very similar to Hokusai's wave. It will probably look very similar to water that you've seen in Japanese animation. It uses those kind of three basic colours to depict depth. And that was created using the wave warp effect in After Effects, and then I drew over it in Flash to give it some nice detail. And you can see that it's looping over and over again. So it'd be ideal for you to use in your animations. Here are some more waves. These are ones that are flowing across the screen. It's a very simple use of the wave warp effect, passing triangles across the screen in different patterns to get this kind of ocean wave sort of feel. And again, you can see that I've used those three basic blues and a little white crest for the wave. Here's some smoke that I did billowing using the same technique, using wave warp. Obviously, the detail in this is done by hand. I drew that in Flash, but the template I created for that animation, the loop, I created in After Effects using wave warp. Here we've got some fire. You can see that's looping over and over again. This was also done in After Effects using wave warp. You can see that I've just used three different colors to depict fire. I've drawn over the template I made in After Effects in Flash, and I've put a little bit of a glow on it to give it that kind of fiery feel. Here is the sort of crest of a wave. If you were depicting a boat cutting through the water, this would be the kind of effect that you would want. And getting animation like this to loop is often very tricky and time consuming. Certainly it's the kind of thing that I find very difficult. So the wave warp effect in After Effects will help you with that. So you ought to have watched my After Effects tutorials if you're not familiar with After Effects. It'll go through all the basic skills that you need to use the wave warp effect. It's really, really simple. You don't need the latest version of After Effects. Wave warp's been around for a long time. Equally with Flash, you don't need the latest version of that either. These are pretty simple drawing techniques using the drawing tools. So let's just talk a little bit about how you can learn more about elemental animation. There's two books by a guy called Joseph Gilland, I do hope that I've pronounced that correctly, called Elemental Magic 1 and 2. He's an expert in special effects animation. He worked for Disney. He's got 30 years experience, and they're two excellent books on animating natural elements. There's a lot of detail about the kind of basics of how these patterns that you see in nature, in smoke and water, can be seen throughout the kind of galaxy, throughout the world. You see them over and over again in nature, and it helps give you an understanding of how these elements work. Of course, Joseph Gilland is so many miles ahead of me as an animator that I can only observe in awe at the things that he goes through in his book. But I definitely recommend checking that out. I'd also recommend checking out ancient Japanese woodblock prints. They do some amazing things with colour and the depiction of water and fire. And also films like Ponyo by Hayao Miyazaki, or in fact any Japanese animation that has water in it, are well worth taking a look at. If you've read Imitation of Life, the Disney book on animation, or if you've read either the Animated Survival Kit or either of the Elemental Magic books, you'll know that there's this kind of animation principle of whip and wave, where if you're animating smoke or fire or water or dust, or a dangling rope or a fluttering cape, there's a simple, flowing, overlapping action that occurs whenever energy interacts with matter which is not entirely rigid. If you take a garden hose, lift it up very quickly and snap it back down even quicker, you'll see a wave travel through the rope or hose just as the wave travels through water. We can move our arms in much the same way. Here's an example of some of my characters doing just that. You'll also see that kind of thing in Adventure Time. So achieving this kind of result is a matter of creating the right timing and also making that animation loop. And those are the parts which I find very challenging and which After Effects can automate for you. Okay, so we're going to jump into After Effects. I'm going to right click in my project panel and create a new composition. I'm going to call it Wave Warp 1. I'm going to make sure I'm using a preset of 1920 by 1080. And I'm using a frame rate of 25 frames a second because I am European and that's the frame rate we use in these parts. If you're in America, you'd want to use the preset 29.97. Next up, I want to make sure that my duration is longer than 1 frame. So I'm going to make it 5 seconds and click OK. So next up, we're going to create a shape layer using the pen tool up here. If you don't know how to do that, please do check out my tutorial on shape layers and how to use them before proceeding with this. So I'm going to click on my pen tool. I've got a really disgusting green fill and no stroke. So if I wanted to turn the stroke off, I'd have to click on this. And I'm going to start drawing my nice sort of triangle shape. You see, as I do that, it fills in green. So next up, I'm going to go over to my effects and presets. So I'm going to type in Wave Warp. You can see that pops up here under Distort. I'm going to drag that onto my triangle. Could drag it onto my shape layer if I wanted, but I'm just going to drag it onto here. You can see when I do that, I get this kind of wave passing through my shape. And if I do a RAM preview, okay, so it's going to play now. So already we've got a bit of animation and all we've done is drawn a triangle and dragged an effect onto it. So let's take a look at some of the options we've got. First up is the wave type. It'll default to a sine wave, but you can change it to a square or a triangle or a sawtooth, which is similar to triangle but sharper. There's a circle, a semicircle, uncircle, noise, which is a useful, more random one, and smooth noise. So let's use sawtooth and let's look at this wave height here. We can bump that up and you can see start to get very interesting results like so. And wave width. So the higher we push that up, the fatter our waves are. We can bump the wave height up a little bit as well. If we bump it up too high, you can see here we start to get the shape fragmenting a little bit. So there we go, something like that. You can change the wave speed. So if I bump that up really high, you can see that when we play it through, it's going much, much faster. There we go. Next up, pinning. We're not going to look at that in much detail, but it's essentially where the waves are pinned to. So is it the top edge, the right edge, the bottom edge, etc. Or you could have none. This only applies in certain circumstances, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. Phase is really useful when you've got more than one wave warp going on at a time. It's a way of starting one after another. So phase just pushes through the animation and makes it start at a different point. It's really useful for looping. Anti-aliasing, depends what quality you want that on. I'm going to stick it on high so I get a crisper image. I'm going to put my wave speed on -1 so that it now travels upwards instead of downwards. And I want to get rid of this bit at the bottom that's so sharp. I don't really like the look of that. I'm wanting this really cool kind of sharp edge at the top, but not so much at the bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new shape layer by clicking up here, can make it black. I'm going to draw over the bottom. So you can see I've now got this much more crisp animation. Might just need to make it a little bit bigger, like so. So there we go. And I think I might quite like to have a curve in this animation so that it looks a bit more like a kind of a sweeping cloud of dust. So I'm going to click on it again. I'm going to use my Convert Vertex tool and click here. Then I've got more options over the way my wave looks. So I can pull these Bezier handles so that it kind of sweeps down like that. You can see my nice black rectangle is stopping us from seeing the bottom being all bent like that. And remember, what we're doing right now is creating a template for Flash. So I'm just going to hit RAM Preview up here and we'll take a look at what it looks like. So now we've got an animation that looks a little bit like that. So perhaps I want to speed it up a little bit. I'm going to make it -2. So it's now a little bit faster. You can see we're losing a bit of the animation here. So I'm just going to turn off this rectangle for a moment. And I think on this shape, it might be a good idea if we added a couple of extra points. So I'm going to click here. I'm going to click here. And I'm going to make both of those sharp corners by clicking with this vertex tool. And I'm just going to pull it down a little bit so that we've got a larger area for the bottom. Then I can turn my black rectangle back on. Just click on that and then bump it down a little bit so that we're not losing any of that information. So there we go. So we've now got this cool fast moving wave. So let's just do a RAM preview and take another look. And you can see we've got this nice fast little animation there. So next up, what we want to do to get this animation, which is running on what we call ones, so that's a new picture every frame, so that's 25 new pictures a second. To get that to mix in with the kind of animation I do, which is much more of a limited style that runs at sort of 8 frames a second, we need to posterize time. So this is another After Effects effect. And what that'll do is it'll make this animation look a bit more limited so that it fits in with the other animation that I'm doing. So let's go over to Effects and Presets. So I'm going to type in posterize, and here we can see posterize time. So I'm going to drag that over onto my little triangle shape. And you can see in my effects controls, I've got posterize time and the frame rate defaults to 24. Even though my project is 25, that's just what this effect defaults to. So I'm going to type in 8, and then we can do another RAM preview by clicking over here. So now you can see we've got that much more limited animation. It still looks really good, and I think it will fit in with the other type of animation that I'm doing. So next up, we need to find our loop. So that's where this animation loops so that we can create a nice little loop in Flash. Wave warp effect is just passing a shape through another shape, so at some point it's going to loop. So this is our first frame here, so we need to look for the next time that we see this. So I'm just going to scrub through our frames and see where I can see that shape. So normally it's around 1 second. There we go. You can see if I click back to 1 second, that's actually where our animation loops. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the work area down to this 1 second. In fact, I might pull it 1 frame before so that we don't get 2 copies of this final frame. And if I do a RAM preview now, we should see a nice little loop. So there we go. This is ready to go into Flash now so that we can trace over it and have a mess about with it. So I'm going to stop that. So to get it into Flash, what we need to do is we need to go up here, and we can either add it to the render queue if you're using CS6 or before, or if you're using CC, you can add it to the media encoder queue. So now that's popped up, we've got our wave warp 001, and instead of H.264, we want to make a PNG sequence. We want to use the preset 1080p 25 sequence. There we go, because we're using 25 frames a second. We need to choose somewhere to save it. So I'm going to save it in this folder I've got on my hard drive here, but I'm going to save it in a new folder. So I'm going to call that folder Wave Warp 001 Frames. Nice capital there. Okay, I'm going to create that, and then I'm just going to click Save. So what this is going to do when we click this play button is it's going to render out those frames that we've created in After Effects as PNG files. So they're just one picture for each frame of the animation, and we can then easily import that into Flash. There we go. That exciting noise means we're ready to go over to Flash. And you can use one of the presets in Flash for creating a new file. Go down to Templates, and in Media Playback, if you choose HDTV 1080, that'll be the right one for you. So we can click OK. And let's just fit that into the composition. Don't need this action safe. And also, you'll see that the frame rate is set to 29.97. We need to change that to 25. And we're ready to go. So I'm going to click on my content layer. I'm going to go to File, Import, Import to Stage. I'm going to find those wave warp frames. Here we go. And I don't want to select them all. I just want to select the first one. So that's the 00100, and I'm just going to click Open. Then Flash will pop up with this little box saying, this file appears to be part of a sequence of images. Do you want to import all of the images in the sequence? And the answer to that is yes. So what it's going to do is it's going to put each of those frames into a frame in Flash. So we'll have our animation laid out for us really nicely. So here we go. You can see that animation is now in Flash. These are, of course, bitmaps and not vectors. If you don't know the difference between the two, I recommend you check out my tutorial on bitmaps and vectors. So what we need to do to work with them in Flash is we need to convert them into vectors. So I'm going to click on my first frame, and we're going to go up to Modify, Bitmap, Trace Bitmap. So when it comes to the color threshold, I've whacked that up to 250. That's really high, but it's just to make sure that we get a nice crisp trace and we don't get any artifacts. Minimum area 5 pixels, that's what I've got it set to. It's up to you how many pixels you want it to sample. Obviously, the lower the value, the more computer resources that I'll take up. We've got curve fit, very smooth, and corner threshold normal. So if you preview that, you can see what it will look like. And then when you click OK, it will apply those changes. So now you can see these are vectors that I can select and manipulate if I want. Really nice, exactly what we wanted. But when I move to my next frame using comma or full stop, you can see that it's actually exactly the same as the one we had before. So we can delete that one. We don't need 2 copies of the same frame. And then if we click on it, we can clear that keyframe so that our first one lasts for 2 frames instead. Next up, move on to the next frame, and you see that's also the same. So we can also delete that one and clear that keyframe. The reason this is happening is because we put posterized time onto this animation. So each keyframe is lasting for about 3 frames. Sometimes it'll be 3, sometimes it'll be 2. Because we're using 25 frames a second instead of 24, this is just the way it gets divided up. So let's move to our next one. And you can see, that is also the same. So we'll do the same for our next one, which is also the same. We can clear that keyframe and move on. You can see by frame 5, bosh, it's changed. So we need to do a new trace. So go and modify, bitmap, trace bitmap, click OK, delete the black. Got our next shape. Let's click on our next frame. You see that's the same. We can just clear that. The next one, also the same. We can clear that. But our next one has changed. So let's go bitmap, trace bitmap, OK, delete black. Move on to our next one. That's the same. So we're going to clear that. Move on to our next one. It's also the same. Let's clear that one. Move on to our next one. That's changed. So we need to go bitmap, trace bitmap, click OK. We can delete that black once again. Move to our next one. That's the same. Clear that. Our next one is also the same. So we can clear that one. And in this frame, it's changed. So we go modify, bitmap, trace bitmap. Click OK. This process is going to go on until the end of this animation here. So I'll just speed through that now. Okay, so we're done. We've got this nice looping animation here. I've forgotten to delete this black here. Let's get rid of that. So here we go. There's another bit of black that I've forgotten to delete there. And we might want to even these frames up a little bit. So I could press F5 on this last frame here. And I might want to reduce the length of this first one by holding down Shift and pressing F5. So they're now all the same length. So that animation's looping very nicely. You can check by pressing the loop button down here and extending the range so that you can see it looping. There we go. So now that we've got that loop, what we can do is we can change the color if we want. We could add some cell shading to it. If you don't know how to do cell shading in Flash, I recommend you check out my cell shading tutorial on my website, hexjibber.com. But what I'm going to do quickly is I'm going to get my graphics tablet out and we're going to have a play around just doing some cell shading on this. All right, so I'm going to change this color from green to maybe a sort of browny color. Might click on this color wheel here just to kind of make it look a bit nicer. It's looking nice. Okay. And maybe I want to create a little highlight on this smoke. So I'm going to use this lasso tool on my graphics tablet just to put a little highlight on the smoke there. So you can see I've now selected this kind of top right edge. So I'm going to go into my colors. I'm going to click on this S and I'm going to just pull it down so it's a bit lighter. Click OK. We've got this kind of cool looking lighter shade. Perhaps I want it even lighter than that. So kind of bump it up here in the B section. Then I can just fill that in. So we've now got a bit of cell shading on this smoke. And we can go through and do that on all our frames. So okay, I've got those done. So let's take a look at this looping. Got a nice kind of hand-drawn quality to it there. It's not perfect, but it makes it look a little bit more interesting. So I think what we'll do next, because we've got this kind of sharp right angle here, which doesn't look very natural, what we're going to do is I think we're going to make these frames into a symbol so that we can more easily move it around. So what I'm going to do is click here on my first frame, hold down Shift and click on my last frame, go to copy frames, and then go insert new symbol. So I'll call this wave warp 001. Click OK. And then I can just right click and paste those frames in. So what we've got now is a symbol called wave warp 1 that will loop these frames over and over again. Because we've made it a graphic symbol, it'll just loop on the timeline. If you don't know how to do loops, check out my tutorial on loops on my website. So I can now delete this layer content by creating a new one and then clicking on the little bin here. And then I can go to my library and I can drag my wave warp animation in. I think I'm going to position it on the bottom of the screen down here so that we're not seeing this kind of very sharp right angle. And press enter. You can see we've got this really nice looping animation. Let's just take a look down here. You can see we've got a bit of brown showing through there. So what I might do is just shove this symbol a little bit further over. There we go. So I'm going to do a quick test. See what that looks like. So there you go. That's the basics of how to use Wave Warp. In the tutorials to come, now that you've got a grip on how to use Wave Warp, I'll show you how I created the effects that I showed you at the beginning, one by one, and you can just follow your way through. So that's the end of this tutorial. I'll see you in the next one. Hey, thanks for checking out this tutorial. Next up, why not take a look at my website, hexjibber.com, where you can find out more about my self-published books, the Hexjibber Colouring and Activity book and the Hexjibber Anti-Revision book. They're both suitable for kids and adults alike and are well worth checking out.